I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, but that trip into the foothills of the Rockies still sits at the top of my list of genuinely terrifying moments. It wasn't the kind of terror you see in movies. No dark figures lurking, no bizarre happenings. Just the raw, primal fear that comes when you suddenly realize you are not at the top of the food chain. The hike in had been perfect. Late summer, the air was crisp but not cold, and the sky had that high, endless blue that makes you feel small in the best way. The trail wound through a mix of tall pines and open, grassy clearings dotted with granite boulders. Birds chattered lazily overhead. My pack was heavy but manageable, and I had all the basics. A small tent, a sleeping bag rated well below the nighttime temps, enough food, a water filter, and my sidearm. A compact 9mm I carried more out of habit than expectation. I had never once had to even unholster it on any trip. I reached a flat clearing near a small creek just before sunset. The place felt right. Open enough to see around, close to water, but ringed by trees that broke the wind. I pitched my tent, set a small fire, and ate a quick meal of freeze-dried beef stew. The night settled in cool and still, the stars spilling across the sky in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who's only ever seen them from a city. The crackle of the fire and the murmur of the creek were the only sounds. I slept well until dawn, the kind of sleep that comes after a long day of hiking and fresh air. In the morning, the world was waking up, birds calling, a squirrel chattering somewhere nearby, and a faint breeze whispering through the pines. I made coffee on my little stove and drank it slowly, leaning against a log and watching the light creep down the mountainsides. By mid-morning, I'd broken down my fire and decided to hike a little further before packing up camp. But first, nature called. I walked about 50 yards away from my tent, past a line of low shrubs to a small dip in the terrain where I'd be out of sight. It wasn't glamorous, but anyone who camps knows the routine. I'd taken my toilet kit with a small trowel and some tissue, and of course I had my pistol on my hip like always. Still, when you're squatting in the woods, pants around your ankles, there's no mistaking how exposed you feel. I was midway through my business when a prickle ran up the back of my neck. It was that deep, instinctive sense that you're being watched, something older than conscious thought. I froze, my body still, my breathing shallow. For a moment, I heard only the breeze and the distant creek. Then, as my eyes scanned the treeline ahead, I saw it, a mountain lion. It stood about 100 feet away, partially hidden between two pines, but its body was unmistakable, sleek, tawny fur, powerful shoulders, and a long tail that twitched once, slowly. Its head was low, ears forward, and its golden eyes were locked on me. The cat wasn't moving toward me, but it wasn't looking anywhere else either. For a split second, my brain struggled to process it. I'd seen tracks and scat before, but never a live mountain lion, not this close. And here I was squatting, vulnerable, my pants bunched at my boots. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every nerve in my body screamed to stand up and run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. Predators chase fleeing prey. I forced myself to stay still, even as my legs trembled. My pistol was at my right hip, but reaching for it meant shifting in a way that would definitely draw attention. The lion's eyes followed every tiny movement I made. Slowly, carefully, I finished what I had to finish, faster than I ever have in my life. My fingers felt clumsy as I grabbed a handful of tissue, trying not to make sudden movements. I kept my gaze on the cat, my breath shallow, my mind screaming at me to hurry. When I finally stood up, I did it in one smooth motion, tugging my pants up with one hand while my other hand eased the pistol from its holster. The metal felt cold and solid against my sweaty palm. I didn't point it at the lion right away, I didn't want to escalate, but I held it low and ready. The cat's ears flicked back briefly at the motion. We stared at each other. 10 seconds, 20. Time stretched thin. The cat took one slow step forward, muscles rolling under its skin. Its paws made no sound on the pine needles. Another step. It was testing me. I took a small step backward, my boots crunching lightly on the forest floor. The cat paused, tail twitching again. I raised the pistol slightly, not aiming, but showing it clearly. I spoke softly under my breath. Not words for the cat, just to steady myself. and kept backing away. The mountain lion held my gaze a moment longer. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it turned. Its body flowed like water between the trees, disappearing into the brush without a sound. The sudden emptiness where it had been made my knees weak. I stood there for another full minute, gun still in hand, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. When I finally let out the breath I'd been holding, it came out shaky. I holstered the pistol but didn't take my eyes off the treeline as I gathered my toilet kit. The forest, which had seemed so calm and familiar just minutes before, now felt alive in a different way. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart jump. I walked quickly back to camp, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. My dog wasn't with me on this trip. Thank God, I thought briefly, because a bark or a chase could have ended badly. But also, I missed the extra set of eyes. Back at the tent, I packed up fast. The idea of lingering another night didn't sit right. The hike out felt longer than it had on the way in. Every shadow looked like a stalking shape, every distant noise a potential threat. I kept my hand near the holster strap the whole time. My senses stayed sharp, scanning the ridges above me for movement. At one point, I thought I saw a flicker of tawny fur between two rocks on a distant slope, but when I blinked, it was gone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was still there, watching. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't even bother changing out of my boots before climbing in. The cab smelled faintly of pine sap and sweat. As I drove down the winding dirt road, my shoulders slowly loosened, but the adrenaline still buzzed in my blood. Back in town, surrounded by buildings and pavement, the encounter almost felt unreal. But that moment, squatting, pants around my ankles, utterly vulnerable, was burned into my mind. I'd always carried a gun just in case, never truly expecting to need it. Now I understood how fast just in case could become real. Even now, when I'm out in the woods and I step off trail to relieve myself, I find myself glancing around first, scanning the trees and brush for tawny shapes and twitching tails. The mountains don't care how experienced you are or how prepared you feel. Out there, you're just another animal on the landscape, and sometimes the top predator is watching you at your weakest moment. I'd been hiking alone for 2 days through rough country in late autumn, the kind of trip I liked most. No crowds, no noise, just miles of empty trails twisting through the foothills. The air was sharp and cool, the kind of air that makes your breath look like smoke even at midday. The ground was covered with brittle pine needles and patches of frost that crunched under my boots. That morning had been uneventful. I'd broken camp early, shouldered my pack, and followed a faint path up a ridge that opened into a long valley. The valley was beautiful but wild. Scrubby pines clung to the rocky slopes, and the floor was a mix of dried grass and low shrubs. The wind whistled through the rocks in that eerie, hollow way that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you know you're alone. I was planning to camp near a creek marked on my map, a spot I'd never visited before, but that looked perfect from the topo lines. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to dim, and the temperature dropped quickly. I found the creek right where it was supposed to be, trickling lazily between banks lined with smooth stones. I set up my small tent on a flat patch of ground near some scattered boulders, gathered some deadfall wood for a fire, and boiled water for a quick meal. As the sun sank, the valley fell into shadow. The wind died down, leaving the world strangely still. I ate in silence, staring at the dark shapes of the surrounding hills. At dusk, I caught movement on the far slope, just a flicker, a shadow shifting between rocks. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a stray dog from some distant ranch. I shrugged it off. Wildlife was part of the experience. Night came fully, the sky so clear that the stars looked almost fake. I stoked my fire higher than usual. The valley was wide, but the darkness pressed in close. The only sounds were the creek gurgling softly and the occasional crack from the firewood. After a while, I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and settled into my sleeping bag. The cold was sharp but bearable. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to a faint sound, something shifting outside. It wasn't the wind. It was heavier, deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, a faint scraping, like hooves on rock. My first thought was deer. They'd probably wandered close to the creek to drink. I stayed still, hoping whatever it was would just pass by. But then there was a low, soft bleat. Goats, I thought suddenly. Just some goats. Maybe feral ones that had been living wild in the hills. I'd heard of that happening in remote areas, ranch animals gone rogue. The bleating came again, closer now, and I could hear multiple sets of hooves clattering on the stones. I turned onto my side, peeking through the small mesh window of my tent. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint glow of the dying fire. Then movement. A pale shape moved past a boulder at the edge of camp, then another. Their silhouettes were blocky and strange in the faint starlight, their horns catching tiny glints as they moved. I felt an uneasy twinge. Goats aren't uncommon in some backcountry areas, but these weren't the domesticated ones I was used to seeing. They seemed bigger, and their movements were oddly stiff, as if they were wary or agitated. I told myself it was nothing, just goats. I lay back, pulled the bag tighter around my shoulders, and closed my eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. The sounds outside grew sharper. The clack of hooves on stone, the rustle of dry grass, the occasional bleat that sounded almost off. Not wrong exactly, but drawn out like a moan. At one point, a set of hooves stopped right next to my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, and close enough that the fabric of the tent seemed to pulse with it. My heart was hammering. I gripped the handle of the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag, telling myself they were just curious animals. But the breathing didn't move away for what felt like a full minute. Then, all at once, the noise stopped. Absolute silence. Not even the creak. The hair on my neck stood up. A sudden clatter of hooves broke the silence as something bolted through the camp. Then another. I heard rocks tumbling down the slope on the far side of the creek. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe. The quiet returned, heavier this time. Eventually, I drifted into a restless half-sleep. When the pale light of dawn filtered through the tent, I unzipped the door cautiously. My camp looked undisturbed at first. Nothing knocked over, no torn gear. But near the fire pit, I found prints in the frost. Hoof prints, lots of them, circling the tent, crossing each other in a tangled mess. Some of the impressions were sharp and deep, the kind made by heavy animals standing still for a long time. I brewed coffee with shaking hands, trying to convince myself it was funny. Just some goats, that's all. Maybe a wild herd had wandered through, curious about the smell of food or the fire. But as I packed my gear, a feeling gnawed at me. On my hike out, I kept seeing signs I couldn't ignore. Clusters of hoof prints in places where the terrain didn't seem to support livestock. Broken branches at chest height where something large had moved through. Once, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I thought I glimpsed a pale shape far up the slope, just standing there, watching. By the time I blinked, it was gone. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt an almost physical weight lift off my shoulders. The world looked normal again. Trucks in the lot, distant highway noise, the smell of exhaust and dust. But as I loaded my pack into the bed of my pickup, I glanced back toward the ridges. In the morning light, they looked harmless, just rugged hills under a bright blue sky. Still, my skin prickled remembering the sound of those hooves and the breathing inches from my tent. I've camped plenty since then, but I keep my fire higher and my eyes wider. Sometimes at night, when I'm miles from anywhere, I catch myself staring into the dark beyond the firelight, half expecting to see pale shapes among the rocks again. And when people ask about the scariest thing I've ever seen camping, I always start with the same words, trying to make it sound casual even as my stomach knots. Yes, just some goats. That's all they were. But I know it wasn't that simple. The way they watched me, the way they circled silently in the dark, it wasn't just goats passing through. It was a reminder of how small and exposed I really am out there, even on a night that seems quiet and safe. I've been camping by myself plenty of times before, so when I decided to take a few days off work in late September and drive up to the national forest, I didn't think much of it. The weather forecast promised clear skies and cool nights, the kind where you can see every star. I wanted the kind of silence you can only get far from roads, the kind where even your own breathing sounds too loud. The forest road wound upward for miles, gravel crunching under my tires. Trees closed in on either side, tall pines and spruces casting long shadows over the track. I found a clearing I remembered from a trip years back. Flat ground, a small stream 100 yards away, and a natural rock wall on one side that made a perfect windbreak. No one else was around, no distant voices, no parked cars, nothing. Just me, the woods, and the low hum of wind through branches. I parked the truck, shouldered my pack, and started setting up camp. My bright green tent went up easily. I gathered dry wood, built a small fire ring with stones, and boiled water for coffee. As the sun dipped lower, the forest took on that golden glow that makes everything look soft and safe. A few birds called to each other. A squirrel chattered angrily somewhere above, probably upset I'd set up near its territory. After dinner, just a freeze-dried meal and a granola bar. I sat by the fire, letting its warmth soak into me as darkness crept in. The stars began to blink awake, one by one. I lay back on a log and stared at them, feeling that old familiar mix of awe and insignificance. Out there, away from everything, you start to understand how small you are. It's a good feeling, usually. Around 10, I doused the fire until it hissed and went dark. The woods around me seemed to grow larger without the flicker of flames. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and pulled my sleeping bag tight around me. The sounds of night came alive, the chirp of crickets, the gurgle of the stream, and every so often, the groan of a tree swaying under its own weight. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when something woke me. At first I couldn't place it. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The crickets had stopped. That kind of silence isn't normal out there. It's the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up before your mind even catches up. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves. One step, then another. The sound came from the direction of the stream. Slow, deliberate, not the frantic rustle of a small animal or the heavy, erratic stomp of a deer. This was careful, controlled. I held my breath and strained my ears. Another crunch, then silence. My heart began to pound, the kind of pounding you feel in your throat. I told myself it was probably just a deer moving cautiously, but the way the steps stopped completely every few moments, it felt intentional. Minutes dragged by. I stayed frozen, afraid even to unzip my sleeping bag. Then the sound started again, closer now. Leaves shifted. A stick snapped faintly. Whatever it was had moved up from the stream and was somewhere between the trees and my tent. I considered turning on my flashlight, but a part of me didn't want to announce where I was any more than I already had by existing there. I thought about the knife I kept in the side pocket of my pack, but it was out of reach, near the tent's door. The crunching stopped again. For a long while, there was nothing, just my own breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. Slowly, after what felt like an eternity, the night sounds returned. First a single cricket, then the others, then the faint gurgle of the stream. I stayed awake for another hour, muscles tense, waiting for more movement. Nothing came. When I woke again, pale dawn light was spilling through the tent walls. I unzipped the door and stepped out. The ground was cold and damp under my boots. I walked a slow circle around the clearing. Near the edge of the trees, I found faint impressions in the soft dirt. They weren't boot prints, at least not the full tread of a boot, but rather the toe and partial heel marks of someone trying to step lightly. No clear pattern, but the spacing was too wide for an animal like a raccoon or fox. Deer leave distinct hoof prints, and these weren't those either. I felt a shiver despite the morning sun. Someone had been out here, watching, passing through, couldn't tell. I rebuilt the fire, made coffee, and tried to calm my nerves. By mid-morning, the woods looked harmless again. Sunlight streaming through branches, birds flitting between trunks. The uneasy feeling faded just enough that I convinced myself to stay another night. That afternoon, I hiked a ridge trail for a few hours, trying to shake the memory. When I returned to camp, nothing had changed. My tent was untouched. The only sound was the breeze through the trees. I cooked dinner, kept the fire small, and told myself the forest was just doing what forests do, reminding you that you're not in control. But as dusk fell, I couldn't help but glance toward the trees again and again. Shadows grew long. The air cooled. I rebuilt the fire, making sure the flames burned high before I finally crawled into my tent. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. The forest was silent. No wind, no insects, just a dead, heavy quiet. I felt it before I heard anything, this sense that the world outside the tent wasn't empty. Then came the sound, the faintest whisper of grass bending under weight. It was behind the tent this time, near the rock wall. I stayed still, every muscle locked. The sound didn't come closer, didn't retreat. It just stayed, a quiet suggestion of movement, as if someone stood just outside, waiting. Minutes crawled by. I could hear my own heartbeat. Suddenly, a rock tumbled somewhere farther down the slope, bouncing off others before settling. The sound was sharp, quick, and distant, but whatever had been near the tent was gone when I listened again. The crickets slowly returned, tentative at first, then in full chorus. I didn't sleep again that night. As soon as the first gray light appeared, I packed. My hands shook as I broke down the tent poles. I stuffed everything into my pack haphazardly and didn't bother with breakfast. By the time the sun broke the horizon, I was already halfway down the gravel road. When I finally reached the highway and the first signs of civilization, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders in a wave. The fear wasn't the kind that leaves you screaming or running. It was slower, deeper, the realization that out there in the dark, someone or something had been close enough to hear me breathe, close enough to step silently through the trees without leaving a clear trail. That night, back in my apartment, I kept replaying the sounds in my head. The crunch of leaves, the sudden silence of the crickets, the deliberate pause between steps. Maybe it was a lost hiker, maybe a hunter, maybe someone camping illegally who didn't want to be found. I'll never know. But now, whenever I camp alone, I keep the fire burning longer than I used to. I double-check the ground for prints before I settle in. And when the crickets stop singing all at once, I lie very still and remember that night. How the forest felt alive and watching. How even in a place that seems empty, you're rarely ever truly alone. I'd been backpacking through Norway for nearly a week by then, trekking alone across stretches of tundra and low, rolling hills broken by clusters of birch trees. It was mid-July, the kind of summer where the sun never truly sets. Even at 2 in the morning, the sky just dims into a washed-out twilight, leaving the land glowing faintly under a sky that never goes black. It's beautiful, but the constant light messes with your sense of time and rest. Nights feel strange, quiet but never fully dark, like the world is holding its breath. The day before, I'd hiked over 30 kilometers across a stretch of open land where the only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the wind whistling over the rocks. By late evening, my legs felt heavy and my shoulders ached from the pack. I'd spotted a small hollow in the landscape where a shallow stream cut through the grass and pooled into a tiny pond. The ground was soft but not swampy, and a low ridge to the west blocked the worst of the wind. Felt like a good place to stop. I set up my tent, a bright orange, high-visibility thing I'd bought specifically for conditions like this. On the tundra, you want to be seen if anything goes wrong. The color blazed against the muted greens and browns of the landscape, a lone dot of warmth in a world of cool tones. After pitching the tent, I boiled water for a simple meal, ate, and sat for a while listening to the distant trickle of the stream. The horizon stretched endlessly, not a soul or sign of civilization in sight. That kind of isolation is what I'd come for, but it also made the world feel enormous and indifferent. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sky had dimmed into a bluish gray that would be the closest thing to night I'd get. I lay there for a long time, half dozing, my body tired but my mind restless. I could hear the faint flapping of the tent fabric in the breeze, the occasional plink of water moving over stones. Sometime in the early morning hours, maybe 3 or 4 by my watch, I drifted into that strange half-sleep you get when camping, aware of every sound, yet not fully awake. That's when the tent shook. At first, it was just a light tug, like a gust of wind, but then it jolted hard enough that my heart slammed against my ribs. The whole structure wobbled violently, poles creaking. My first thought, irrational and immediate, was that someone was messing with me. A random hiker, maybe drunk, maybe lost, tugging at the lines of my tent in the middle of nowhere. My stomach tightened in a flash of anger and adrenaline. I shot upright, heart pounding, and scrambled for the zipper. I didn't even bother putting on a shirt or boots. I was barefoot, wearing only my pants as I shoved the flap open and crawled out, ready to yell at whoever was out there. The sight that met me froze me mid-breath. In every direction, as far as I could see, the tundra was alive with movement. Caribou, reindeer, hundreds of them, their gray-brown bodies shifting like waves, antlers rising and falling like a forest of branches in motion. They were everywhere, their breath fogging faintly in the cool morning air, their hooves making a low, constant crunch over the grass and gravel. The herd stretched out across the plain, a slow, endless river of animals moving around me. I stood barefoot in the wet grass, shivering in the cold light, my bright orange tent a strange, foreign object in the middle of their migration. The closest animals were barely 10 feet away. Their eyes glinted as they flicked nervous glances at me, their bodies tensing, ready to bolt if I moved too suddenly. Then I saw it. One reindeer near the edge of the herd had its leg caught briefly on my guy line. The thin rope had snagged against its hoof as it passed, and when it pulled free, it had jolted the entire tent, explaining the violent shake that had ripped me out of sleep. My sudden appearance had startled the herd, but they didn't flee. They slowed, their movement cautious but steady, flowing around me like a stream around a rock. The sound was overwhelming. Hundreds of hooves clicking against stones, the low grunts and snorts of animals communicating, the swish of fur against fur. The air smelled of damp earth, musk, and the faint, wild tang of living creatures. I stood there for what felt like forever, afraid to move, every nerve on edge. The herd wasn't aggressive. They didn't charge or surround me, but there was a raw, primal tension in the air. These were powerful, heavy animals, and I was just one fragile human in their midst. If one spooked and bolted, the rest could follow, and a stampede would crush anything in their path, including me. Slowly, carefully, I stepped backward toward my tent, not taking my eyes off them. The nearest caribou flicked its ears but didn't react. The herd kept flowing, a steady current. I crouched beside my tent, my feet numb from the cold ground, and waited. The migration lasted another 20 minutes. More and more animals passed, their antlers clattering softly when they brushed against one another. Some calves trotted close to their mothers, legs awkward and quick. The sky had brightened by now, pale sunlight spilling over the horizon, painting their coats gold at the edges. When the last stragglers disappeared over the ridge, the silence that followed was so deep it made my ears ring. The grass around my tent was trampled flat, small clumps of fur clinging to the guy lines where the caribou had brushed past. My tent sagged slightly on one side, a peg pulled halfway out of the ground. I sat on a rock, still barefoot, my breath shaky. My heart was only just beginning to slow. The reality of it settled over me. I had camped directly in the path of a migrating herd. If I'd reacted differently, if I'd shouted, run, or startled them badly, things could have ended very differently. Out here, far from help, even a single broken bone could be a disaster. A panic stampede would have left nothing standing. As the sun climbed higher, warming the tundra, I made myself a strong cup of instant coffee and ate a granola bar while I fixed the tent. My hands were still trembling as I tightened the guy lines. The horizon looked empty again, the landscape quiet and harmless, but I couldn't shake the image of those dark eyes and shifting antlers surrounding me. That day, I packed early. I didn't feel like staying put anymore. As I hiked toward the next ridge, I kept scanning the horizon, half expecting to see another wave of animals cresting the hills. But the land was still and bright, the only movement the wind rippling through the grass. Looking back once, I could see the faint tracks the herd had left, hundreds of hoof prints pressed into the earth. curving around the spot where my tent had stood. The sight made me feel small, a reminder that out here, the wilderness isn't yours. You're only borrowing space, and sometimes you're directly in the way of something much bigger than you. Even now, years later, when I think of that morning, I remember how helpless I felt standing there in my bare feet, surrounded by caribou. It wasn't the kind of horror with screaming or blood. It was quieter, more profound. A deep, unsettling awareness of how fragile you are under an endless sky, how easily nature can remind you that you're just another thing on the landscape. And whenever I pitch my tent now, no matter where I am, I always check the ground, the ridges, and the valleys, making sure I'm not in anyone else's path. I had been looking forward to that weekend alone in the woods for months. My job had been grinding me down, and the thought of 2 full days without cell service or emails felt like a lifeline. I picked a state forest I knew was remote, one with miles of backcountry trails where I could be sure I wouldn't run into many people. I left my car at a nearly empty trailhead early Saturday morning. The air still cool and wet with last night's rain. The sky was gray, low clouds clinging to the treetops, and the smell of damp leaves was thick. I threw on my pack and started the slow climb into the hills. The trail was muddy in places, littered with slick leaves. My boots sank in with soft squelches, and every step made a sucking sound when I pulled free. I could hear water running somewhere downhill, probably a swollen creek from the rain. The forest felt still, like everything was holding its breath. I liked that feeling, the weight of quiet out there, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the drip of water off the trees. By early afternoon, I had covered about 8 miles and reached a small clearing where an old fire ring marked a good camping spot. The ground was soft but not soaked, and the trees formed a natural windbreak. I set up my tent, stashed my food in a bear bag, and gathered some damp wood to try and coax a fire to life. It took longer than usual to get a flame going. The smoke hung low, biting my eyes. I sat on a fallen log, eating a cold sandwich and staring at the fire, letting the quiet soak into me. As the light faded, the forest turned darker than I expected. Heavy clouds blocked the moon and stars, and by the time I crawled into my tent, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The night was cold, damp air seeping through the fabric, and I slept in short, broken stretches, waking often to the sound of dripping water or the occasional distant crack of a branch. At one point, I thought I heard something heavier moving through the underbrush, but when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing. Morning came slow and gray. My sleeping bag was clammy. I brewed some instant coffee over a small flame and decided to hike further along the ridge before looping back. The trail beyond camp was narrower, less maintained, and the ground was still slick. The trees crowded close, and the undergrowth thickened. There were no footprints, no signs of recent traffic. It felt like I was moving deeper into someplace forgotten. A few hours later, I was several miles from camp and already thinking about turning back when I caught a whiff of something off. Faint at first, like a sour, rotten smell mixed with wet leaves. I assumed it was a dead animal. The wind shifted and the smell vanished, so I kept walking. But 100 yards further, it returned, stronger this time. The air grew heavier, thick enough that I could taste the sourness at the back of my throat. The trail curved around a stand of hemlocks and opened into a small clearing I hadn't expected. The ground here was churned up like something or someone had been moving around a lot. I froze, scanning the area, trying to make sense of it. At first, all I saw was fallen branches and soggy leaves. Then my eyes caught on something pale against the dark earth. It was a shoe, a single, mud-caked sneaker, lying on its side. A little farther beyond it, another shoe, this one half buried. My heart picked up. I took a few cautious steps closer. The smell was overwhelming now, sickly sweet and putrid. I saw a torn scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch, dark blue and stiff with mud. My stomach knotted. I knew what this was going to be even before I saw it. 10 feet further into the clearing, at the base of a rotten log, there was a shape, a human shape. It was a body, or what was left of one. The clothes were shredded, faded from sun and rain. The skin was gray, loose, and the limbs were twisted in a way that made it clear the person had been there for a long time. The face was partially gone, the jaw slack and teeth exposed. The smell was so strong I had to turn my head and swallow hard to keep from gagging. Flies swarmed in slow, lazy circles. I felt my legs go weak. For a second, I couldn't breathe right. My first thought was that this could have been an accident, a hiker who slipped, broke a leg, and never made it out. But as I stood there, I noticed details that didn't fit. The way the clothing was shredded unevenly, like it had been torn by hands or tools, not just weather. The disturbed ground around the body looked like more than animal activity. There were drag marks leading out of the clearing, faint but visible in the mud, disappearing into the brush. The silence pressed in on me. I realized I had been standing there too long. My brain screamed to leave, to get away before whoever or whatever had left this here came back. I backed away slowly at first, then turned and started walking fast, trying not to run but unable to stop glancing over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves felt too close. I kept replaying what I'd seen, the twisted limbs, the drag marks. I didn't know if it was foul play, an animal, or something worse, but I knew I didn't want to stick around. I reached my camp in record time, my lungs burning. My hands shook as I stuffed my sleeping bag and stove into my pack. I didn't bother taking down the tent. I left it staked in the ground, flapping slightly in the breeze. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. My boots slipped on the mud as I half jogged, half walked. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The forest, which had felt peaceful and alive the day before, now felt watchful and hostile. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. By the time I saw my car through the trees, my throat was dry and my legs ached from pushing so hard. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I unlocked the door, threw my pack in the back seat, and peeled out of the lot, tires spitting mud. I drove until I had cell service again, pulled over on the side of the highway, and called the authorities. My voice shook as I gave them the location as best as I could. They asked me to stay nearby until someone could meet me, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. Later, after a long wait at a gas station, a deputy met me. I told him everything: the trail, the clearing, the body, the shoes, the drag marks. His expression stayed neutral, but I could tell he was taking it seriously. He said a team would go in to recover the remains and investigate. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of my tires on wet pavement. The forest that had seemed like a retreat now felt like a threat, a place where terrible things could happen and go unseen. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to stepping on that clearing without realizing what it was. How easy it would have been for whoever or whatever had left that body to still be nearby, watching. Even now, weeks later, I can still smell that sickly rot when I close my eyes. I can still see the pale shape against the dark earth. Out there in the quiet woods, miles from anyone, I stumbled onto something I should never have seen. And I know without a doubt that if I had arrived just a little earlier, or stayed just a little longer, I might not have walked out at all. I always thought of Assateague Island as a place where nothing bad could really happen. It was a strip of sand, grass, and salt marsh that seemed frozen in its own slow-moving time. When I was a kid, our Boy Scout troop camped there every summer, and those trips left me with a pile of good memories. Wild ponies grazing by the dunes, the sharp tang of salt air in the morning, and the way the ocean roared all night like a living thing. I grew up, but the island stayed stuck in my head, golden and simple, a place where the world felt harmless. When I was in my early 20s, a few of us from the old troop decided to relive a piece of those summers. Most of the guys had drifted off, busy with jobs or college, but I couldn't shake the pull of that beach. So one weekend in late summer, I went back alone. I pitched my tent on the bayside, a little away from the main clusters of campers, because I wanted the quiet. The island has a way of swallowing you up at night. You can walk just 100 yards and suddenly feel like you're the only person for miles. By sunset, the sky was bleeding pink and orange over the flat water, and I sat on a weathered log eating a sandwich and watching the wild ponies in the distance. The air smelled like brine and dry grass. The mosquitoes were already out, whining around my ears, but that was part of the deal out there. I stayed up late just listening. the slap of small waves against the shore, the rustle of grass as crabs skittered through it, and the occasional snort of a pony out past the dunes. Around midnight, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The sand under my thin ground pad shifted a little when I moved, and I could feel the faint vibration of the surf through the earth. Sometime before dawn, I woke up needing to pee. The air inside the tent was humid and cool. My watch said a little after 4. Outside, the sky had that deep, heavy blackness just before it starts to lighten, and the stars were sharp and close. The wind was low, and the only sounds were the water and the hiss of sand sliding against sand. I slipped on my boots and stepped out into the damp air. The beach was wide open to my left, but inland, just beyond a stand of grass-tufted dunes, I saw an orange glow that shouldn't have been there, pulsed faintly, like something was moving around it. At first, I thought maybe another camper was up early making breakfast or some fisherman had a lantern set up, but the light was strange. It flickered too widely, like a fire. Curiosity tugged at me. The island is long and empty enough that you don't often run into other people, especially not at that hour. I walked quietly toward the dunes, the sand sucking at my boots. As I crested a rise, the wind shifted and I caught the faint, steady beat of a drum. Low, like a heartbeat against the open night. I crouched without thinking. The glow was stronger now, and when I moved closer, I saw a small clearing between the dunes, shielded from the beach by grass and scraggly shrubs. In the middle was a bonfire, a real one, flames licking high, embers sparking up into the darkness. Around it, maybe 6 or 7 people were dancing. They were naked, completely naked. Their pale skin caught the firelight in flashes as they moved, shadows slipping over them in weird patterns. Their bodies didn't look graceful. They weren't all young or beautiful, and some of them stumbled or spun awkwardly, but there was something unsettling about the way they danced. It wasn't playful or joyful. It was deliberate, like they were keeping time with something I couldn't hear, even beyond the drumbeat. I froze, standing half-hidden in the grass. The only thing I could hear was the thud of the drum and the crackle of the fire. The smell of burning driftwood mixed with the salty air. My first thought was that it was just some eccentric group of hippies who came out here for a private thing, maybe some harmless ritual. But there was a tension in the air that crawled under my skin. The way they moved around the fire wasn't random. They were circling in unison now, slower, shoulders hunched like they were bowing to something invisible in the flames. The drumming grew faster. One of them stomped hard, sending sand flying. Another threw their head back, hair whipping. I couldn't make out any faces clearly. The firelight distorted them, and they never stayed still long enough. But I had the sense of eyes darting around, like even among themselves they weren't completely at ease. Then the drumming stopped all at once. The silence was so sudden it made my ears ring. Every dancer froze mid-step. The only sound was the distant crash of surf. My heart thudded. One of them, tall, thin, hair hanging over their face, stepped toward the edge of the clearing, not far from where I was crouched. They turned their heads slightly, and for a second, I was sure they'd seen me. I sank lower, trying to make my body small against the sand and grass. The air was thick, my mouth dry. After a moment, the tall figure turned back toward the fire. Another person bent and threw a handful of something. Sand? Ash. Into the flames. The group began humming softly, low and uneven. I didn't wait to find out what came next. My boots barely made a sound on the packed sand as I backed away, heart hammering. By the time I reached my tent, my legs were trembling. I didn't even bother untying my boots. I climbed into the sleeping bag and zipped it up to my chin, trying to breathe quietly, though I was alone. For a long time, I lay there, staring at the fabric above my head, every small noise magnified. The flap of the tent in the breeze, the crunch of some animal in the dunes. I must have dozed off, but when the sun came up, the world outside looked normal again. The sky was washed in soft pink light, the ponies grazed like nothing had happened, and there was no sign of smoke on the horizon. Part of me wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But when I walked up to the dunes later, careful to retrace my steps, I found a patch of blackened sand and charred driftwood buried halfway in the grass. Around it, the sand was stamped with footprints, bare human feet, dozens of prints circling the fire pit in tight loops. I didn't see anyone else on my hike back. No drummers, no dancers, no naked figures. Just the gulls wheeling over the shore and the hiss of wind in the grass. But the footprints were real and the fire had been real. When I packed up that afternoon, I took one last long look at the island. It was still beautiful, still peaceful on the surface, but I felt something different about it now. The wildness wasn't just ponies and tides. It was the kind of wildness that makes people shed their clothes and dance in the dark where they think no one's watching. It was the kind that doesn't need an audience or a reason. Driving off the island, I kept glancing at the dunes in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a flicker of orange light or hear a faint drumbeat carried on the wind. There was nothing, just sand and sky and that endless stretch of ocean. But even now, years later, whenever I think of Assateague, it isn't the ponies or the sunsets that come first to mind. It's the sight of those silent, naked figures turning slowly around a fire, and the feeling that I was never supposed to see them. I've camped enough over the years to have a few stories that still make my stomach tighten when I think about them, but one trip has stayed burned into my mind more than the rest. It was supposed to be a normal 4-day break. Me and my best friend out in a semi-remote spot we'd been to once before. The kind of place that only a decent 4x4 can get to, far enough from main roads that you don't hear engines or see headlights, but not deep wilderness either. It was semi-maintained, if you could even call it that. There were 2 crooked fire pits ringed with old rocks, a couple of rotting picnic tables with splintered benches, and 2 leaning outhouses that looked like they might collapse in the next strong breeze. From what we'd been told, the park rangers only checked the site maybe once a year. The drive-in had been a slow crawl over rutted dirt roads, pine needles crunching under the tires as we passed through miles of jack pines. The air was sharp and clean, and the forest smelled like resin and damp earth. We arrived late in the afternoon, golden sunlight cutting through the branches. The quiet out there was heavy, the kind that makes you aware of every distant creak or gust of wind. We set up our tents side by side and started arranging our gear. My friend wandered off to check the outhouses. A minute later, he came back with an odd look on his face and told me to go look inside the first one. I figured I'd find something disgusting, some animal carcass or a mess left by careless campers. When I opened the door, I froze. There on the floor, against the back wall, were 3 full backpacks. Big ones, the kind you'd pack for a week-long trip into the backcountry. They looked like they'd been placed there deliberately, zipped up tight and leaned neatly against the wall. There was no one else around, no signs of recent campfires or footprints except our own. We opened them, curiosity overruling any hesitation. The first 2 were full of perfectly good camping gear. Clean sleeping bags, cookware, and well-organized clothing. Nothing strange about the contents themselves, except for the fact that the packs had clearly been abandoned. The 3rd bag was something else entirely. It was stuffed completely full of Skittles. Bulk bags, little bags, regular, tropical, sour, every size and flavor you could think of. I had never seen that many Skittles in my life. It had to be 80 liters of candy crammed in tight. We stood there staring at it for a long minute, the smell of sugar oddly out of place in the cold, pine-scented air. The whole thing made the hair on my arms prickle. Who would leave gear like that? Who hikes all the way out here just to fill a bag with candy and leave it hidden in a toilet? We didn't see another soul for the next 4 days. No vehicles, no hikers, no signs of anyone coming back for those packs. When we finally packed up, the bags were still there, untouched. We reported it when we got back to town, but I never heard what, if anything, the rangers found out. That would have been enough to make for a weird story on its own. But a different trip still unsettles me more. It was a spur-of-the-moment overnight hike with just me and my dog, a mixed-breed shepherd who usually made me feel safer in the woods. I didn't go far off the road, maybe a mile or so, just enough to be away from casual foot traffic. I set up a simple tarp shelter, lit a small fire, and settled in. I wasn't trying to hide, but I wasn't exactly advertising my presence either. The forest felt empty, just me and the steady hum of crickets. Sometime after dark, maybe close to midnight, I heard an engine. At first it was distant, just a faint growl echoing through the trees, but it grew louder quickly. A truck barreled up a nearby road I hadn't realized was so close. The sound carried over the ridges, bouncing between the pines. My dog perked his ears and growled softly. Then I heard shouting, drunken voices, loud and careless, cutting through the quiet like broken glass. I couldn't make out words, but there was laughter, too hard, wild laughter that didn't sound friendly. A moment later came the gunfire. The first crack made my chest tighten. It was close, far closer than I would have ever wanted. Then another shot, then two in quick succession. The voices cheered. Another shot rang out, and the echo made it hard to tell exactly where it came from. But the lay of the land suggested they were firing in my direction. I crouched low, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My dog shifted beside me, his body tense, the leash tight in my hand. I hadn't realized how near that other road was when I set up camp. I was parked on a different access road entirely, thinking I was tucked away. But now it was clear I was far too close to a bunch of drunk guys with firearms. The wind shifted, carrying their voices again, closer now. Another shot split the night, this one followed by a ricochet sound that made my skin crawl. I didn't even bother to douse the fire properly. I kicked dirt over it fast, yanked my tarp down in a single motion, and stuffed it in my pack. My fingers felt numb and clumsy, but I managed to get everything together in under a minute. I clipped the dog's leash to my belt to keep my hands free and started moving fast, hunched low, weaving between the trees. The ground was uneven, with roots and fallen branches ready to snag a boot, and every crunch of leaves underfoot felt impossibly loud. Behind me, another burst of laughter echoed, then another round of gunfire. My brain kept feeding me worst-case scenarios. A stray bullet hitting the tarp I just left, someone deciding to drive deeper into the woods for fun, or drunken hunters mistaking movement for a deer. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. It would have been a beacon, so I moved by feel and faint moonlight, angling away from the sounds, heart racing. It took nearly 40 minutes to make it back to the road where my car was parked. By then, the voices had faded, and the gunshots had stopped. My dog stayed pressed against my leg the whole way, silent except for quick, shallow breaths. When I finally saw the faint glint of my car's bumper through the trees, a surge of relief made my knees weak. I didn't bother taking my boots off or even checking the pack. I just shoved it into the back seat, lifted the dog in, and started the engine. My headlights cut across the forest, illuminating nothing but empty trees. I drove until I hit a main road, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires replaced by smooth pavement, and only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I didn't stop driving until I was 20 miles away. I pulled into an empty gas station lot, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a while, listening to my dog's steady breathing. The quiet of the forest, which had always been a comfort to me, now felt sinister in my memory. That trip changed the way I camp. I still go out there, but I'm far more careful now, more aware of roads, of signs that others might be nearby, of the fact that not everyone out in the woods is sober, sensible, or even aware of their surroundings. Nature itself can be dangerous. Windstorms knocking down jack pines, branches snapping like gunshots, but it's the unpredictable behavior of people that haunts me the most. To this day, whenever I hear gunfire echoing somewhere in the distance while I'm camping, I feel that old surge of adrenaline. I grip the dog's leash a little tighter. I scan the trees and take a mental note of the fastest way back to my car. The forest hasn't changed, but I have. And I'll never again forget how quickly a peaceful night under the stars can turn into something that makes your pulse hammer and your hands shake long after you're safe.